The cold wind howled through the narrow streets of Falaise, a town in the heart of Normandy, as the year 1174 drew to a close. The once proud William the Lion, King of Scots, stood before Henry II, the King of England, his head bowed in humiliation. The stone walls of the castle seemed to echo the weight of his defeat. On this bleak December 1st, William was forced to agree to the Treaty of Falaise, a document that would forever change the fate of Scotland. William, a man known for his fierce spirit and determination, had led a rebellion against Henry II, but his forces were crushed. Now he was nothing more than a broken king, a mere vassal to the English crown. The treaty stripped him of his dignity and power. He was made a personal liegeman to both Henry II and Henry the young king, and his castles were confiscated. The Scottish barons, bishops, and clergy were ordered to swear allegiance to the English crown and church. Scotland's proud history of independence was now a mere memory, its future tied to the whims of a foreign ruler. But even in his moment of triumph, Henry II was not focused on revenge. He was a man with a vision, a ruler who understood the importance of restoring order and stability to his vast dominions. The peace at Montlouis, where the rebels had finally submitted, was a testament to his shrewd political mind. It marked the high point of his reign, a moment when his authority was unquestioned and his power absolute. The Plantagenet court in the mid-1170s was a spectacle of grandeur. Henry II had emerged as the preeminent ruler in Europe, defeating his enemies and securing his borders. King Louis VII of France, once a formidable adversary, had been roundly defeated and now sought a non-aggression pact with Henry. The French king, Louis, and the Count of Flanders, Philip, visited Henry's court, acknowledging his supremacy. The Plantagenet court was a hub of international diplomacy, receiving envoys and ambassadors from across the Christian world. Henry's sons, who would form the next generation of European rulers, had been put to good use. They were tasked with quelling the last embers of the rebellion and asserting their father's authority. The young King of Scots, William the Lion, was a regular visitor to Henry's court, a humbling reminder of the Plantagenet's dominance. In 1175, Henry's influence extended to Ireland when King Rory O'Connor of Connaught agreed to the Treaty of Windsor, recognizing Henry as the feudal overlord of most of Ireland. 2 years later, Henry named his young son John as the High King of the entire country. It seemed that no one could challenge Henry's power, not even the mighty Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, whose fortunes were waning after a defeat by the Lombard League in 1176. Henry's court was a beacon of prestige and power. His daughters, Matilda and Eleanor, were married into the royal houses of Saxony and Castile, respectively, cementing alliances that would shape the future of Europe. The youngest, Joan, was sent to marry King William II of Sicily at the age of 10, further extending the Plantagenet influence. But Henry's triumph was not just about international relations. He was determined to restore order and authority within his own lands, especially in England. The Great War had left the country dotted with castles and fortifications, symbols of the local power of his enemies. In 1176, Henry took a decisive step to assert his authority. According to the chronicler Roger of Howden, he took every castle in England into his own hand. He expelled the castellans and placed his own men in charge, even forcing his most loyal servants to surrender their castles. The message was clear. The authority by which the barons and bishops of England held castles and arms derived from one source, only the king. Castles were a symbol of military power, and Henry invested heavily in them. He rebuilt and fortified castles across his empire, from Newcastle upon Tyne to Windsor. Dover Castle, perched on the white cliffs overlooking the English Channel, was his crowning achievement. It took 12 years to complete and cost nearly £6,500, more than two-thirds of the total expenditure on English castles during the final decade of his reign. When Louis VII visited England in 1179, Henry proudly showed him the construction site, a clear display of his superiority. But Henry was not just a builder of castles. He was a legal innovator. The Assize of Clarendon, decreed in 1166, brought the entire system of English criminal law under royal control. Criminals were to be tried by the ordeal of water, a brutal ritual where the accused was immersed in water. If they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty and faced mutilation, banishment, or death. In 1176, the Assize of Northampton reissued and strengthened these laws, making punishments even harsher. To bring justice to the people, Henry divided England into 6 judicial circuits, where royal judges traveled to investigate crimes and settle land disputes. The Assize of Novel d'Assise allowed royal justices to question juries about contested lands, ensuring that the king's law was the ultimate authority. The Royal Council was reorganized, and 5 members were appointed to remain at Westminster, forming what would become the Court of King's Bench, England's Supreme Court. By 1182, Henry's judicial reforms had transformed England. The castles that dotted the landscape were symbols of the royal monopoly on military power, and the fingers of royal justice reached into every corner of the land. Henry's will, announced at a great council in Bishop's Waltham, made bequests to religious houses and the poor, but it made no provision for Eleanor, who remained under close guard. Henry continued to travel across his vast territories, but his body was showing the strain of a lifetime of relentless activity. His legs, bowed from years in the saddle, ached constantly, and an old injury from a horse kick left him with a permanent limp. Despite his physical decline, Henry's mind remained sharp, and he was still the most formidable ruler in Europe. As the year 1182 drew to a close, Henry II stood at the peak of his power, a man who had built an empire and transformed the land he ruled. But the future held challenges that even the greatest of kings could not foresee. The world moved on. King Louis VII of France died in 1180 at the age of 60, after a long illness that left him paralyzed. His 15-year-old son, Philip II, was already crowned co-king and now took the throne. Suddenly, Henry II of England had to deal with a young king instead of an older, more experienced one. Philip was younger than all 3 of Henry's eldest sons, and only a few months older than John. Henry felt like a figure from another era, and the future of France seemed to belong to these young men. Henry's eldest son, also named Henry, was now Philip's new rival. He had been crowned as a junior king and sometimes called himself King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Aquitaine, son of King Henry. But he referred to his father as of famous memory, which hinted at his frustration. Despite his titles and marriage to a Capetian princess, the young king had almost no real power. He was 28 years old in 1183, yet he lacked political intelligence and military skill. Many people saw him as vain, shallow, and immature, more interested in tournaments than ruling. The young king spent most of his time on the tournament circuit, where he was a regular with other young nobles like Philip, Count of Flanders, and Baldwin, Count of Hainault. His tournament captain was William Marshal, a famous knight who had been the young king's tutor. At Philip's coronation in 1179, the young king represented the Plantagenets, carrying the Capetian crown and bringing 500 knights to the celebratory tournament. But despite all this, he knew he had little real power. In the summer of 1182, the young king demanded some territory from his father, where he and his wife could live and support their knights. He wanted control of Normandy, but Henry refused. Humiliated, the young king stormed off to the French court and allied with Philip II. Henry tried to bring his son back by offering him a larger allowance and calling a family meeting in Le Mans after Christmas. The meeting included the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and the Duke of Saxony, who had been expelled from his duchy along with Henry's daughter, Matilda. Henry's goal was to keep his sons united. He asked them to swear allegiance to him, and then had Richard and Geoffrey do homage to the young king for their duchies. Richard refused, saying he owed homage to the King of France, not the King of England. He had spent years establishing his rule in Aquitaine, and was not about to give it up. The young king had been making trouble in Aquitaine, trying to win over the barons and stirring up rebellion. Richard and the young king had a bitter argument, and Richard stormed out, fortifying his castles. The young king sent his wife to Paris for safety, and prepared to attack. Henry had no choice but to support Richard to prevent a civil war among his sons. The war that followed was short but disastrous. The young king negotiated in bad faith, attacked envoys, and robbed towns and churches to pay his mercenaries. Henry and Richard struggled to keep control. In June 1183, the young king fell ill with dysentery and died in Martel. Before he died, he asked William Marshal to carry his crusader's cross to Jerusalem and to plead for his mother's release from prison. The young king's death threw Henry's succession plans into chaos, After mourning, Henry began to plan a new future. In the autumn of 1183, he told Richard to give up Aquitaine to John. Richard refused, saying Aquitaine was his. By 1184, Henry realized Richard was stubborn and let him keep Aquitaine. He sent John to Ireland to establish his rule there, and considered making Geoffrey the young king's heir. Richard raised an army and attacked Geoffrey's borders, forcing Henry to intervene. In 1184, Henry brought Eleanor out of captivity to demand that Richard surrender Aquitaine to her. Richard did, but Henry avoided making any firm decisions about the succession. Without a clear heir, Henry's grip on his lands was weak. In July 1186, Geoffrey died after being injured in a tournament in Paris. He was buried with great honor in Notre Dame, and Philip II was deeply shaken. Henry had lost 2 sons and was more troubled than ever. He refused to make Richard his sole heir, believing no one could hold together his vast lands. Relations between Henry and Philip II cooled. Richard had been engaged to Philip's half-sister Alice since 1161, but the marriage was never finalized. Philip began to use this to his advantage, suggesting that Henry intended to marry Alice to John. In 1187, Philip began to exploit the tensions between Henry and Richard. He charmed Richard with promises and whispered that Henry planned to name John as heir. Richard, eager to join the crusade, believed Philip and knelt before him, doing homage for Aquitaine and Normandy. This was a final break with his father. In 1188, war broke out between Philip and Henry over Berry and Toulouse. At a peace conference in Bonmoulins, Richard demanded assurance of his succession. Henry said nothing, and Richard did homage to Philip. In 1189, Henry fell ill, and Richard refused to return to him. Instead, he helped Philip launch attacks on his father's territories. In June 1189, Philip and Richard attacked Le Mans, where Henry was born. The town was unprepared and a fire broke out, forcing Henry and his attendants to retreat. Despite his illness, Henry attempted a forced march north into Normandy. As Henry and his army marched, the weight of his troubles grew too heavy. For the first time in his life, he gave up. Just 10 miles from the border fortress of Alencon, he turned back. He sent most of his guards ahead to Normandy, while he returned to Anjou. It was a dangerous journey, as the roads and countryside were filled with Philip's men. After traveling 200 miles, Henry finally reached Chinon Castle, one of the most impressive fortresses in his lands and a place he loved. By the time he got inside, he was completely drained. He took to his bed, growing sicker and weaker each day. By early July, things had gotten even worse. Maine was taken over and Tours had fallen. Despite his illness, Henry managed to meet Philip at Ballon, near Tours, on July 3rd. Philip demanded a lot Henry's total surrender and confirmation that Richard would inherit all his lands on both sides of the Channel. Henry, too weak to even stay on his horse, had to be held up by his attendants. It was a hot day that turned into a thunderstorm. Henry agreed to Philip's terms, but he was too weak to ride back to Chinon. His servants had to carry him home in a litter. Back at Chinon, Henry could barely stand. He asked for a list of all the supporters who had betrayed him, and joined Richard's side. According to Gerald of Wales, the first name on the list was his favorite son, John. The shock and grief were too much for Henry. He fell into a final illness, hallucinating and raving. In a moment of clarity, he received Holy Communion at the castle chapel. Then, on July 6, 1189, Henry died. Henry's life, filled with both triumph and tragedy, ended in misery. He had been betrayed by his wife and all his sons, seen his birthplace destroyed, and suffered humiliation at the hands of a much younger king, but his impact was enormous. He had ruled over vast lands in France and the British Isles, mastering every king, duke, and count who challenged him. His fame echoed through the ages, and he left a legacy that shaped Europe for centuries. King Richard takes the throne. Richard stood silently over his father's body. He looked down at the face of a man who had lived through nearly 50 years of war and glory. Henry had died a bitter and lonely man, but Richard had taken much of his inheritance by force. After Henry's death, the rest would pass to him by law. Henry's body was taken to the Abbey Church of Fontevraud, a grand monastic site between Anjou and Poitou. As Richard stood vigil, he felt the cool air and the weight of the moment. He looked at his father's motionless face, then turned and walked out. A new era had begun. News of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin in 1187 had spread across Europe. Saladin's victories were legendary, and the Christian world was in shock. Richard heard stories of the brutal treatment of knights, the execution of soldiers, and the loss of the true cross, the most sacred relic in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Crusading was both a spiritual duty and a family matter for Richard, as his cousin Sybil was the Queen of Jerusalem. Richard was the first nobleman north of the Alps to take the cross in 1187. His departure was delayed by his conflicts with his father, but he was determined to set sail for the Holy Land. First, he needed to secure his inheritance and make peace with Philip II. On September 13, 1189, Richard was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. Crowds gathered to see the man they had rarely seen before. Richard was tall, elegant, with reddish-blonde hair and long limbs. The ceremony was grand, with bishops, abbots, barons, and knights in attendance. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was overjoyed. She had been freed from captivity and restored to her lands. She traveled around the country, securing oaths of loyalty. Richard made 3 oaths at the altar: to protect the church, administer justice, and abolish bad laws. He was anointed with holy oil and dressed in royal garments. He received a sword to defend the church and golden spurs to symbolize his knighthood. Afterward, he was crowned and led to his throne. England was gripped by crusading fever. Preachers traveled throughout Europe, recruiting thousands with promises of forgiveness and eternal life. Richard prepared a massive fleet and gathered supplies: ships, food, weapons, and more. He raised funds through various means, even selling titles and lands. He joked that he would sell London if he could find a buyer. Richard met Philip II at Nonancourt after Christmas 1189 to discuss a mutual defense pact. They agreed not to attack each other's lands and to protect the goods of crusaders. Despite the pact, mutual suspicion remained. The most challenging issue was what to do with his brother John. John, now known as John Lackland, was given significant lands and titles, including the earldoms of Derby, Nottingham, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and Dorset, and marriage to Isabel of Gloucester. Richard appointed loyalists to govern in his absence, with his mother Eleanor keeping an eye on John. Finally, with his armies ready and a fleet set to meet him in Marseille, Richard met Philip II in Burgundy. They swore to share their gains equally, and set off for Jerusalem on July 4, 1190. Richard carried a sword he believed to be Excalibur, ready to put it to good use. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her young charge began their journey over the Alps in the winter of 1191. The road was difficult, with freezing temperatures and steep terrain. They traveled slowly, resting in monasteries and enduring the hardships of the journey. They were heading to Pisa, where they would continue their journey to the Holy Land. Eleanor of Aquitaine had a big job ahead of her. She was taking her 18-year-old charge, Berengaria of Navarre, on a long and dangerous journey to meet her son, Richard, who was headed to the Holy Land for the Third Crusade. Berengaria was known for her wisdom more than her beauty, and she had an honest nature. This journey had been planned for years, and it must have taken a lot of persuasion to convince Sancho VI, Berengaria's father, to let his daughter go on such a risky trip. Having Eleanor, who was famous and controversial, as her guardian would have been both comforting and worrying for Sancho. Berengaria knew her marriage to Richard would be controversial because Richard was already engaged to Alice, the sister of Philip II of France. They had been betrothed since they were children, but Richard had his eyes set on Berengaria. Only a few people knew about his secret plans. Eleanor, who was still very capable despite her age, handled all the diplomatic tasks during the journey. They even met with Henry VI, the son of Frederick Barbarossa, in Lodi, near Milan. Berengaria must have felt the importance of her role, as she was joining one of the most influential dynasties in Europe. After missing Richard in Pisa, Eleanor and Berengaria finally caught up with him in Sicily on March 30th, 1191. Richard had been in Sicily for 6 months and had already had a lot of adventures. His army had landed in Portugal, where they caused chaos, and then met Richard in Marseille before sailing to Sicily. Richard had also conquered Messina, which belonged to King Tancred of Sicily, despite a deal with Philip to share the spoils. When Philip learned that Richard planned to marry Berengaria instead of Alice, he was furious. Richard had kept it a secret until the last moment, and Philip was forced to accept the news and take a large sum of money as compensation. He left Sicily in a rage before Berengaria arrived. Eleanor stayed in Sicily for a few days to see her son and her daughter Joan, who had been freed by Richard from King Tancred. Joan then became Berengaria's chaperone, as they prepared to leave for the Holy Land. Richard's next stop was supposed to be Crete, but a storm forced some of his ships, including the one carrying Joan and Berengaria, to land on Cyprus. The ruler of Cyprus, Isaac Comnenus, mistreated the passengers, and there was even an attempt to capture Joan and Berengaria's ship. Richard, hearing about this, landed at Rhodes on April 22nd and decided to punish the Cypriots. On May 5th, he captured Limassol after a fierce battle. To celebrate, he married Berengaria on May 12th in a Byzantine chapel. The wedding was attended by Guy of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem, and other notable figures. It was a unique and significant event, symbolizing the vast reach of the English crown. After the wedding, Richard's army spent 3 weeks conquering Cyprus. They split into 2 groups and sailed around the island, capturing towns and castles. Isaac Comnenus, the ruler, was captured when his daughter was taken in Kyrenia. Richard treated Comnenus with respect, binding him in silver manacles. Richard then sold Cyprus to the Templars for a large sum of money. From Cyprus, Richard could see the coast of Lebanon, and the Holy Land was now within reach. He set sail and arrived at Acre on June 8, 1191. Acre had been under siege for over a year, and the scene was grim. The city was surrounded by Christian armies, including those of Philip II, and the siege was brutal. Richard joined the siege, but he soon fell ill with a disease that made him weak, and caused his hair and nails to fall out. Despite his illness, he continued to lead the crusade, even firing a crossbow from a litter during a battle. On July 5th, Acre's defenses finally broke, and the city fell. Richard and Philip had agreed on terms with Saladin, the Muslim leader, to avoid a bloody sack. The Muslim garrison was allowed to leave honorably, and the city was taken with minimal further bloodshed. However, Richard's arrogance caused tension with his allies. He removed the flag of Duke Leopold of Austria from the royal palace, which infuriated Leopold and Philip. After Acre, Philip announced that he had fulfilled his crusading vow and was going home. This was seen as cowardice, but Philip was tired of being humiliated by Richard, especially over the issue of who should be the king of Jerusalem. Richard and Philip backed different candidates, and Philip felt his interests in Europe were more important. He left for France on August 3rd, leaving Richard as the de facto leader of the Third Crusade. Richard was now in charge, with a large army and a fleet, and he had the prestige to lead the crusade. However, the longer he stayed in the Holy Land, the more problems grew back home. His brother John, who was left in charge, posed a threat, and the absence of a direct heir added to the tension. Richard's time in the Holy Land would bring him more glory, but it also brought challenges that could affect his rule. Richard's journey back from the Holy Land was far from smooth. After his successes and failures in the crusade, he faced a new and unexpected challenge: his own imprisonment. News of his brother John's treachery and the political turmoil in England only added to his worries. Richard the Lionheart was now a captive, and his legend was about to take another dramatic turn. Richard's return voyage began with a series of setbacks. He learned that his enemies, including King Philip of France and Duke Leopold of Austria, had blocked almost every route back to his kingdom. The seas were rough, and his ship was wrecked off the coast of Istria in the Adriatic. Disguised as a pilgrim, Richard and a small group of loyal followers set out on foot through Central Europe. But the most famous crusader in the world could not hide for long. 3 days into their journey, they were recognized and denounced. Richard was arrested and handed over to Duke Leopold, who then sold him to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire for a fee. Imprisoned in the imperial palace of Hagenau, Richard found himself a prisoner of one of the most powerful men in Europe. Despite the risks, he composed a song in Aquitaine, the language of his homeland, expressing his frustration and homesickness. The song, Janus Hans Pris, became a poignant reminder of his plight and his hope for freedom. Back in England, the situation was dire. John, Richard's brother, had seized the opportunity to challenge for the throne. He paid homage to King Philip of France and agreed to marry Alice, Philip's sister, who had once been betrothed to Richard. John then returned to England and tried to raise a rebellion. However, the kingdom was not without its defenders. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's mother, and Walter of Coutances, the justiciar, rallied the loyalists and fortified the coastal defenses. King William the Lion of Scotland, remembering Richard's past kindness, refused to join the rebellion. Hubert Walter, Richard's trusted friend and newly elected Archbishop of Canterbury, led a council that recognized the need to secure the king's release. Richard's captivity was a political and diplomatic nightmare. The Pope, who had forbidden the imprisonment of crusaders, was pressured by Richard's supporters to intervene. Meanwhile, Richard's mother and his loyal subjects in England worked tirelessly to raise a ransom for his release. The cost was enormous, but the stakes were even higher. The fate of the kingdom and the Plantagenet dynasty hung in the balance. After months of negotiations and the collection of a massive ransom, Richard was finally released in February 1194. He returned to England, where he was greeted as a hero. John's rebellion was crushed, and the kingdom was once again under Richard's rule. The Lionheart had faced his greatest test, and he had emerged victorious, his legend only strengthened by his trials. Richard's crusade in the Holy Land had not achieved all he had hoped, but it had solidified his reputation as a fearless and determined leader. His return from captivity and his reassertion of power in England proved that he was not just a warrior, but a king who could overcome any obstacle. The legend of Richard the Lionheart lived on, a symbol of courage and resilience in the face of adversity.